I was at the peak of my powers through that period where we were at a fairly low ebb, and I probably took it on myself to really try and be the backbone of the batting. I was playing well. I just understood my responsibilities. The lead by example scenario rather than being the forceful communicator behind the scenes. And that's just honed into you from those setbacks you have along the way.
In the 1980s, Australian cricket had reached rock bottom, torn apart by internal divisions, rebel tours, and the rising star of a great West Indies team. Yet for over a decade, one man stood firm. The reluctant captain who defied them all, paving the way for the greatest era of dominance in Australian cricket history.
We just looked at Allan Border and thought, that's the player we want to be. The consistency and the grit and determination to play well under pressure was fantastic.
AB's greatest ability was his hunger and competitive nature.
Over 10,000 Test match runs. I don't think there was a better player that I was involved with in that same dressing room than Allan Border.
He was building for the generation to follow him, and perhaps that's one of the reasons why we're inclined to underappreciate him.
They call him Captain Grumpy and that sort of thing. Well, it wasn't bloody easy leading Australia.
Allan was a pioneer, a serious pioneer for what he wanted to get done.
I don't think there's any doubt that without Allan Border, our side would not be the same. You know, he was truly iconic.
I'd call him the godfather of the captains that followed him and of the teams that followed him. I'm probably a bit biased in that respect, but he was my main man.
He is such a pure man. There are very few men on this earth I have more respect for than Allan Border.
I was a classic youth of Sydney in the 1970s who, played a bit of cricket at the weekend and didn't take it too seriously, and played a bit of baseball and mucked around with his mates.
There was other interests, baseball being one of them. Wandering down to the beach, down at Balmoral Beach, not a bad part of the world if you've ever been there. So it wasn't the be-all and end-all for me cricket-wise. I just thought, what am I doing? I'm wasting my time. I've got to, start really getting some structure. It was Barry Knight, English all-rounder. He was the coach of the Mossman Cricket Club at the time, and he was always into me about taking the game more seriously. So he was a bit of a catalyst for change, probably around about that age, 18, 19, somewhere around there.
From the mid-1970s, he becomes a young prodigy, an emergent batsman.
He was a well-known star amongst youngsters in the game.
Just as Allan Border was finding his feet in the game, however, media mogul Kerry Packer set up a breakaway cricket competition in 1977. World Series cricket split the game in two as the world's best players joined Packer's cricket revolution.
In the next 2 years, Australian cricket is plundered by Kerry Packer, bombed back to the Stone Age, has to turn sort of second 11 teams into first 11 teams.
At the time, I guess it ripped the heart out of cricket pretty much all around the world.
Border kind of has to fill the vacuum, as it were. His emergence as a player is accelerated by the schism that's overtaken the game in Australia.
Australia named Bruce Yardley as 12th man, and England chose John Lieber, and this of course gave Allan Border, the young New South Welshman, the chance of playing in his first test.
The amount of players taken out of our system obviously helped a lot of us younger players to get an opportunity that we mightn't have got. You just never know how things might pan out for you. So I'm very thankful to Mr. Packer and the World Series Cricket for just that opportunity that I was given way ahead of time.
When I saw him, I thought, boy, this bloke can play. And I was right. He could play.
Border initially impressed, scoring an unbeaten half-century in only his second test against England in January 1979. He was unable to halt a 5-1 Ashes defeat, though, as Australia struggled to cope with the fallout from World Series cricket.
Everyone was looking over their shoulders, waiting for the selector's axe. It was chopping and changing the side a lot, trying to, come up with the right formula of cricket team.
When the game's wounds are healed in the late 1970s, he and Kim Hughes are the players of the establishment who are good enough to acquit themselves in the United Teams.
We were all pretty pleased for them to come back because, we were young blokes sort of thrust in, and we had to play the West Indies without our senior players.
I think everyone was aware of the fact that, for example, people like Kim Hughes and Allan Border hadn't played World Series cricket, but they were Australian and they were on our side, they weren't on the opposition.
Allan was certainly well regarded in that sort of sphere and firmly embraced as one of the senior guys, no problem at all.
I made a real point of, just sitting in the dressing room. We're talking about guys that in my late teens, when I was really starting to get into cricket, these were the heroes. Lilly, Chappell's plural, Marsh, etc. And all of a sudden I found myself in the same dressing room. So I sat in those rooms and didn't leave until they left.
With their influence, Border went from strength to strength. No longer just a stand-in, he was now a fully established Test cricketer.
He soon proved that he was a player that could handle any situation.
It was quite interesting to see how he handled the pressure, and that was the thing that amazed me, that no matter what the pressure was, he was able to absorb it.
Allan, as a younger player, was a real free-scoring player. Played his shots, batted at 3, and I could see Allan batting at 3 and me batting at 4 because that was our personalities and becoming great players together, if you like.
Border's performances were the only bright spark of an otherwise disappointing Ashes tour in 1981, scoring big runs when all else around him failed.
It was a tour where Border came to the fore in a role that was to become pretty familiar for him, which was filling a gap. Greg Chappell hadn't gone on that tour. Australia was one great batsman short, and that mantle fitted very well on Allan Border's slim shoulders.
He got 100 in Manchester, I reckon. Might have got 100 at the Oval as well, with a broken hand. He was a hell of a good player. Fighter, real fighter.
I started to really get the gist of what Test cricket was all about through those early 80s, particularly that 81 series. Talk about looking over your shoulder. There's none of that type of situation. You feel confident that you're going to get a game next week.
Border's consistency and determination were becoming increasingly key assets for an Australian side in transition, especially against the West Indies, who had overtaken Australia as the dominant team in world cricket.
In the 1980s, a yardstick of your accomplishment as a batsman was what you were able to achieve against the West Indies.
We had some of our roughest times playing against Allan Border in West Indies, Australia matches. He was always the fellow who was going to be there at the end of the day, who was going to give you some trouble.
Very, very, very gutsy, very tenacious. And you don't have to be at any huge figure or a man mountain for you to be successful. Allan, to me, with that size, was just as huge in terms of his heart.
To watch Allan batting against Big Bird Garner, and Garner's letting him fly from an incredible height, And there's AB, he's not taking a back foot step, he's climbing into it and he's cutting from balls that are around shoulder height, and you see him race to the fence, and the next one's a Yorker and he whips it off his legs, and it just goes on as, you know, you just get a different appreciation of the skill the man had.
By 1984, Border was vice-captain to Kim Hughes. However, trouble was brewing. Australia had lost 5 games in a row to the West Indies, and Allan Border was about to emerge as the apparent answer to all Australia's problems.
There was a state of emergency in Australian cricket in 1984. The retirements of Greg Chappell, Dennis Lillee and Rod Marsh at the start of that year. You had the West Indies emerging as a superpower in world cricket. The misadventures and comings and goings of Kim Hughes.
He was a sweet guy, but he just wasn't a captain.
Speculation, criticism and innuendo by former players and section of the media over the past 4 or 5 years have finally taken their toll.
We were in the throes of losing yet again, and Kim came up to me with a note, and it was basically his resignation speech. I didn't think he needed to make that decision.
In the interest of the team, Australian cricket,
I ended up putting him in the NUA with me resigning. He then was thrust into the position because he was the next best player, if you like, and it was a position that he didn't really want.
He didn't have to justify his performance, justify his selection, justify his entitlement to be one of the leaders and the obvious person to go to. So, yes, you're right, he was probably reluctant, but when you consider, well, who else have we got? There was no choice.
There's that sense of excitement that you're going to be named the Australian captain, but there's also that sense of dread that, I'd seen what it done to Kim Hughes. We're playing against a very rampant and good West Indies side. You know, where was the joy in being the captain of the Australian cricket team at that point?
No sooner had Border taken on the captaincy than Australian cricket was thrown into further chaos.
12 months into doing the job, I'm reluctant as it is, and then you have a rebel tour, and I didn't know anything about it. I remember I was up at Noosa with a mate of mine with our young kids, just having a couple of days break before we left on the Ashes tour of '85. I heard on the radio that there was a rebel tour, and there was 6 or 7 of the Ashes tourists that had signed to go on this rebel tour.
I went to South Africa in the rebel tour, along with a lot of other people. That left Allan Border in a fairly dicey situation with a lot of kids having to start all over again.
That didn't help my positive mindset to doing the job, because I felt a little let down, I've got to admit, at the time.
During that frustration, I think he just actually sort of toughened up and went hard at it, and I don't think he ever looked back.
As Australian cricket reached its nadir, Border remained its rock. While his teammates succumbed easily, Australia's captain Grumpy single-handedly carried the fight to opposition teams.
Through that period, Border provides a kind of a consistency and continuity that is otherwise lacking. Common experience for an Australian cricket fan in the 1980s was waking up, finding that Australia on the other side of the world was horribly embattled and facing defeat, but always your next question was, is Border still in? Because he was kind of the Horatius on the bridge figure. For as long as Allan Border was still at the wicket, hope still abided.
I must admit, I don't like getting out, and for a long period of time I batted, say, 5 and 6 in the test side, so you're inevitably batting with the tail, and I always had that feeling, you've got to be last man out.
Not a lot of people have appreciated